Hello and welcome back to another episode of Lab Insider, this time with a special Q&A. We're joined here by Professor David Wood of The Ohio State University. Welcome back, Professor Wood.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
We're not going to take up too much of your time because we are all running. We have schedules, we have emails, we have classes. So let's get right to the questions. Professor Wood, where do you see the innovations? Where do you see them going?
So in my area, which is mostly biopharmaceuticals and medicine, I think the innovations are going to head toward personalized medicine. Obviously, gene therapy is hugely hot right now. And at the manufacturing level, there's movement to sort of more traditional chemical engineering type approaches like continuous processes and more compartmentalized processes. So these are things that we see in professional conferences constantly.
Where would you see the research laboratory environment? Where would you see it in 5 years' time?
Where I would like to see it is more practical innovation coming out of the research labs in academia. That being said, there's always a balance in academia of sort of fundamental research and applied research. And I tend to be very much in the area of applied research. And so I like to see my students being trained to go out there and make a contribution. But I recognize everything I do started out as fundamental research. So in 5 years' time, I'd like to see more of a merging of the pure research with the applied research so that we can streamline some of these new discoveries into useful innovations more quickly. And that's just going to require more collaboration and more open-mindedness on both sides.
How well do you think this will actually pan out over the course of the next years? Are we prepared for the challenges ahead?
I think yes. I'd like to see more. I'd like to see it be easier to get money for academic labs. But I think that the United States especially has done a good job. They've recently greatly increased the budget to the National Science Foundation, and the NIH budget's increasing as well. It seems like it's something that's been prioritized by our leadership. And so my hope is that can be translated to easier, faster innovations in the laboratory. And I think there's always room for more and better sciences. And the challenges that the world is facing, I mean, I think in terms of healthcare, but environmental change, how to deal with plastic, these are things that are becoming really important for us to figure out. And I think the government, at least our government and many governments around the world, are starting to take that pretty seriously. And so more and more, we're starting to see university researchers looking at those kinds of problems.
But what would be the number one thing that needs to change?
I'd have to think about that. There's a lot of things that need to change. The thing that you have to understand is that when you plant the seeds, it takes years for the trees to grow. And that's sort of a metaphor. The students that are being trained today as undergrads, it's going to take them years to become really productive faculty. And so if there's only a handful of professors right now working on, say, renewable energy or how to get rid of plastics, they're producing students who may eventually be very important for solving these problems, but it's going to take them a long time to grow. And so if I was going to say what's the one thing that needs to be changing, one is if the government puts money toward programs, they'll draw more people to work on it because people come toward the money. And so I think that's probably one thing that would have to happen. The other thing I think that's sort of obvious to everyone at this point is to separate politics from science. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, as a scientist, it blows my mind that there are companies that still deny climate change and would see the world burn for profit. I mean, you don't burn your own house down for anything, right? And yet we see companies still pushing this idea that, you know, this isn't a serious problem and we don't have to worry about it. And so, unfortunately, they have money. They influence politicians. Politicians influence funding policy. The funding isn't there to support that research to solve those big problems. And unless you're curing cancer, things get really complicated. And so what I would like to see is more scientists go into politics and see a better marriage between real scientists and politics, and maybe displace some of the relationship between profit-driven business and politics. and create more of a balance there. I think that would make a big difference.
Professor Wood, if you have one piece of advice you'd be able to share with aspiring laboratory managers, what would that advice be?
Try as hard as you can to trust the people that are reporting to you. When I first came in, I wanted to do everything myself, and the only data I trusted was the data that came from my own hand. If you're going to manage people and become an effective manager, but also effective in generating data, at some point you have to be willing to hand that baton off to somebody else and trust them that they're going to run with it just as fast as you could. So for a new laboratory manager, I'd say, and you may have to train people a lot, but focus on getting to a point where you trust them to do the work, because ultimately that's what you want, is to have people who can do the work with you, people who can do the work for you, and you don't have to worry about whether the data is going to be valid or not.
In that case, one last question. Do you have any recommended readings or publications or media that you'd recommend for us?
I was thinking about that question, and I realized what I read is the industry journals, industry newsletters. So things like Bioprocess International, STAT, The Scientist. A lot of these, they look a lot like spam, but they actually have a lot of really relevant articles. And so there's one called STAT, there's one called The Scientist, and they're just really interesting, but there's also Bioprocess International, and I'm probably forgetting some others. But these are newsletters that if you start letting your email get out there, those letters will find you. And instead of just immediately hitting the delete key, at least skim the topics that they have, because you may suddenly realize that these are things that are actually important to how you do your job. And so now I get sort of an absurd number of these sort of daily newsletters from all kinds of publications, and I don't spend much time on any of them, I'll be honest, but I do at least kind of glance through. And if something catches my eye, I'll click it and read it. And more often than not, I'll be sending it to my students for them to read too.
Professor David Wood, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.